Where the hell is my house? I had just come back from a year-long deployment, boots still dusty from the desert. I was supposed to surprise my mom. But instead of my home, there was a dog park, my porch replaced by a poop bag station, and that's how the HOA declared war on a U.S. soldier. Stick around, because what happens next will have you cheering louder than a courtroom verdict. This is HOA Karen Files, where petty power meets unstoppable payback. Hit that subscribe button, and let's burn down the bureaucracy. The taxi rolled to a slow stop just before the gravel driveway, what was supposed to be my gravel driveway. My boots hit the ground with a thud, dust from Afghanistan, still clinging to the soles, each step heavy with exhaustion and anticipation. 11 months. 11 months without seeing my country, without sleeping in my bed, without hearing the chirp of crickets in the Georgia twilight. I had imagined this moment in detail, hugging my mother, sipping black coffee on the porch swing, maybe even crying quietly in the shower with relief that I'd made it home. But none of that was going to happen, because my house was gone. I blinked once, twice. No amount of blinking brought back the white cottage with the blue shutters, no porch swing, no driveway, no mailbox with the hand-painted numbers, 2149. In its place was a fully fenced-in, bark chip-covered dog park. A woman in yoga pants was tossing a frisbee to a pair of golden retrievers. A man wearing mirrored sunglasses leaned on a leash while sipping a smoothie. A sign near the entrance read, Willow Glen Community Park, sponsored by the Willow Glen Homeowners Association, for peaceful living and communal joy. My legs went numb. I turned, scanning my surroundings, hoping, begging that I'd gotten the address wrong. But then I saw it, the old oak tree on the edge of the lot, the one I'd carved my name into with my mother's kitchen knife the night before I deployed. The bark was weathered, but the letters were still there. CR, my initials, my tree, my land. I staggered toward it like a man wandering into a memory. My house had stood right here. I could still feel it where the porch had been, where the kitchen window overlooked the garden. And now 3 retrievers were shitting where my dining table used to be. That's when the woman with the smoothie approached. "Excuse me, can I help you?" she asked, eyeing my duffel bag. "Yeah," I said, still dazed. "I'm trying to get home." She raised a single judgmental eyebrow. "This is community property now. The dog park's closed to non-residents after dusk. I am a resident. I own this land." She let out a short laugh. "Sweetheart, that land was foreclosed 6 months ago. Some government guy stopped paying taxes or something. The HOA took it over. They did a whole ribbon-cutting ceremony. That's when it hit me. I was the government guy. And I hadn't stopped paying anything. I'd filed the proper forms before I left. I had military exemption, just like every other deployed soldier who doesn't want to come home to a financial apocalypse." I looked her dead in the eye and said the only thing I could muster, this was my house. She gave her poodle a tug and muttered something about calling security. I spent the next 6 hours in bureaucratic purgatory. City records said my property had been transferred to the Willow Glen HOA after a prolonged period of delinquency. The county clerk printed out a title transfer, complete with my name crossed out, and someone named Karen L. Harwick listed as the HOA representative. I asked how that was possible when I had submitted federal paperwork exempting me from any tax liabilities during deployment. The clerk, who couldn't have been more than 23, shrugged and said, "You'll have to take it up with the HOA, sir. We don't control their internal processes." Internal processes. What was this, a private country? I arrived at the HOA clubhouse just after sunset. The building was more extravagant than I remembered: freshly painted gaudy Greek columns and a 6-foot banner that read, HOA Spirit Month. Inside, a woman stood at a podium with a crystal goblet in one hand and a laminated rulebook in the other. She had short blonde hair, a pearl necklace, and a smirk that could make a wolf turn vegetarian. Karen, I knew the type before she opened her mouth. She was the kind of person who fined people for parking 2 inches over the curb, the kind who printed neighborhood reminders in Comic Sans and mailed them with passive-aggressive Post-its. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I used to own the home at 2149 Maple Drive." I said, "Until I came back today and found a dog park where my bed used to be." Oh, she said, not even trying to feign surprise. You must be Mr. Ross. Yes, I remember the property. It was deemed unoccupied, and in violation of multiple visual code ordinances, I was deployed active duty. Her eyes didn't blink. We can't verify that I filed a federal exemption. It's protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. She pulled out a file folder, flipped a few pages, and said, well, I don't see any correspondence on record. The home was seized under Subdivision Compliance Protocol 12B. The structure was in disrepair, and the landscaping was a mess. It was a lawn, I said, barely restraining my voice. Not a war zone. She offered me a tight, professional smile, the kind that comes right before a lie. I'm sure this is all very upsetting for you, she said, but we'd be happy to offer you one of our unclaimed lots in Phase 4. There's one behind the community dumpsters. The nerve, the arrogance, the sheer insanity of being told to live next to trash after risking your life overseas. I left before I did something that would get me court-martialed. That night, I checked into a motel outside the neighborhood. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in uniform, still gripping the duffel bag like it might anchor me to reality. I stared at the cheap wallpaper, the flickering fluorescent light, the remote control that didn't work, and I tried to breathe. But all I could think about was the rocking chair that used to sit on my porch. My mother's chair, the one she gave me just before she passed. It had survived 3 hurricanes, 2 breakups, and a dozen home repair disasters. I wondered where it was now, probably crushed under a dog park fence. This wasn't just about a house. It was about everything I'd fought to protect being spat on by the very people I thought I'd been protecting. It was about honor being reduced to red tape. It was about a woman named Karen thinking she could wipe out a veteran's life with a clipboard and a zoning code. And that's when the decision hardened inside me like steel. They weren't going to get away with this. This wasn't over, not even close. The morning after the shock of seeing my childhood home replaced by a fenced-in dog park, I sat in a corner booth at Millie's Diner, the only place in town that still brewed coffee strong enough to peel paint. The waitress, an older woman named Darlene, who remembered me from high school, kept the mug full. Without asking, I was still in uniform. Partly because I hadn't unpacked, mostly because I needed people to see it. The newspaper rack near the counter had the local weekly edition. The front page boasted a cheerful headline about the Willow Ridge HOA winning a Regional Beautification Award. I stared at the photo, Karen Mallister, all pearls and pastel power, smiling like she'd won a Peace Prize, flanked by 2 board members and standing precisely where my porch swing used to be. After 2 refills and 1 untouched plate of eggs, I made my way to the Willow Ridge Community Clubhouse. It was located just past the 2nd roundabout, the kind of building designed to resemble something far older than it was. Columns out front, faux brick veneer, iron lanterns that hadn't seen a match in their lifetime. Inside, it smelled like lavender cleaner and entitlement. Karen Mallister sat behind a long white desk at the far end of the lobby. The desk was too large for the room, clearly custom-built to feel like a throne. On the wall behind her hung a portrait of herself holding a shovel at a groundbreaking ceremony. The caption read, Karen Mallister, Founding Visionary. She was scolding someone over the phone when I stepped in. Her voice was syrupy and passive-aggressive, the kind of tone only people who'd never been told knew how to perfect. I don't care if the gnome is a family heirloom, Mrs. Taggart. It violates our front lawn ornamentation code. If it's not gone by Thursday, we'll assess a fine. She hung up and looked at me. Yes, I'm Cole Ramirez. I said I used to live at 1428 Maple Trail. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, then softened with something that looked like smug recognition. Oh, the Army man, she said. Yes, I remember the file. That lot has been repurposed. Repurposed, I repeated, for community benefit. We turned it into a dog park. It really has improved property values. I held out a copy of my deed. This land is mine. She barely glanced at it. That property was foreclosed upon unpaid taxes. We followed procedure. I filed for military exemption before my deployment. I said federal law protects service members from exactly this kind of situation. Karen leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her lips. Well, I don't know what to tell you. We went through the appropriate channels. The land was vacant, unmaintained. A blight, it was mine. Not anymore, she said, folding her hands. Now I understand this must be frustrating for you. So let me make a peace offering. I braced myself. There's a plot near the maintenance shed, she said, small but peaceful. No dog park, you can even decorate the fence how you want. I stared at her. You stole my home while I was overseas. Bulldozed it, turned it into a dog bathroom. And now you're offering me a consolation prize behind a trash bin? She didn't even blink. Soldiers should understand sacrifice. That line hit harder than any mortar blast. I stood up slowly. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. Her smile tightened. That's your right. But I wouldn't get my hopes up. We're a very well-run organization. Our documentation is airtight. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. Back at the motel, I called Luis Ortega. We served together in Kandahar. He owed me for pulling him out of a flipped Humvee during a night patrol gone wrong. Luis had gone into cyber forensics after discharge and now worked for a federal agency that specialized in white-collar crime. When I explained what happened, he whistled. Man, they really did you dirty. Can you help me prove it? Already on it, he said. Email me. What you've got, deed tax exemption, forms, any letters? I'll scrape the rest. I scanned and sent everything. By sundown, Luis had already flagged several inconsistencies in the HOA's filing. The foreclosure paperwork was signed by someone who hadn't worked at the county tax office in years. The notary stamp was expired. The sale to the HOA transferred through a shell LLC, registered to Karen's cousin. I think we've got fraud, he said. Good, I said. Now let's burn their house of cards down. Luis worked fast. Within 48 hours, he dug up archived emails from public servers, obscure meeting minutes from the HOA board, and a list of transfer deeds that read like a money laundering scheme disguised as suburban progress. It wasn't just my house. Two other properties, both once owned by military families, had mysteriously changed hands during their deployments, only to reappear in HOA newsletters as community improvements. And the cherry on top, a congratulatory email from Karen to her cousin, dated 3 weeks before the supposed foreclosure. That soldier's lot is the last domino. Once it's cleared, we'll finally get the permit for the meditation garden. Keep it clean. He's military, might raise hell when he's back. Hell was indeed coming. The next step was legal. I reached out to a JAG officer I'd worked with in Kabul, Captain Dana Whitley. She now practiced military-focused civil law in D.C. and specialized in violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, SCRA. This is textbook illegal. She said, scanning the files Lewis compiled. Under the SCRA, no HOA bank or entity can initiate foreclosure or seizure without court approval, while a service member is deployed. They didn't even try to hide this. They just hoped you wouldn't come back. I asked her how long a legal suit might take. If we go through the civil courts, months, maybe years. But there's another option. I listened as she laid it out. We'd file a formal federal complaint through the Department of Justice's SCRA Enforcement Division. That alone could freeze any transactions involving my former land. Then while they handled that, she'd draft a civil suit against the HOA, the Shell LLC, and Karen personally. But what we really needed was pressure, public, financial, political. That's when I knew we'd need the media. I contacted Jessica Harper, an investigative journalist who once embedded with our unit for a month in Kandahar. Her reporting had helped expose a cover-up involving civilian casualties. She was sharp, fearless, and absolutely allergic to bureaucratic abuse. I sent her the file. Within an hour, she texted, I want this story. All of it. 2 days later, Jessica was at my motel scribbling notes as I pointed out the remains of my foundation in the dog park. She took photos, interviewed neighbors, and even confronted Karen at the HOA office I'm recording. Jessica said as she pushed past Karen's faux smile. Karen tried her best to dodge the questions. We followed every protocol. Jessica cut in, even the one that involves bulldozing a veteran's home during deployment and repurposing it for dog poop. Karen's smile twitched. The next morning, the story dropped on the front page of a major online news outlet, Deployed and Dispossessed. How an HOA stole a soldier's home. The article included side-by-side photos, me in uniform standing beside the dog park sign, a screenshot of the HOA plaque, and a quote from Karen about keeping neighborhoods uniform and secure from unpredictable elements. The backlash was immediate. My phone exploded with messages from friends, strangers, veterans, even active duty soldiers who saw the story. Then came the noise Karen never expected. Veterans groups rallied, several demanded investigations into HOA overreach across the country. Congressmen tagged in social media posts, started making phone calls. A local veteran-owned business offered to help rebuild my home. Donations rolled into a legal fund set up by Dana. Karen tried to save face with a statement to the press. The HOA acted in accordance with community standards and within its rights under local ordinance. But her statement backfired when someone leaked audio of her saying, "He should be thankful we didn't turn it into a skate park." Even her own board began to flinch. Lewis called that night, got something new, he said. A video shaky phone footage from inside a closed HOA board meeting. In it, Karen mocks my mother's porch swing, jokes about those army types, and laughs about how the soldier's not going to sue. They never do, I forwarded it to Jessica. She published an update within the hour. Headline, "Those army types leaked HOA footage, sparks national outrage." I didn't sleep that night, but it wasn't anger keeping me awake. It was momentum. My story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to every deployed soldier who'd returned to find their home gone. Their rights ignored, their sacrifice treated like a bureaucratic inconvenience. And the woman behind it all. She had finally realized the storm she'd created wasn't going to blow over. It was going to bury her. The morning after the story went viral, I sat on the porch of a nearby veteran-owned diner, coffee in hand, watching a line of news vans crawl past the entrance to Willow Glen. Karen's HOA fortress had become the focus of national scorn, but that wasn't the win, not yet. Media rage burns hot and fast. I needed this to be more than a headline. I needed results. That's when I made the second most important call of my life. I dialed Colonel Sam Trent. "Sir," I said, "remember when you told me to call if I ever needed backup stateside?" Pause. "Ramirez, is this about the HOA thing I just saw on the news?" "Yes, sir. And I've got an idea. I just need it to be loud," he chuckled. "How loud we talking? Federal, uniformed, and undeniable?" By sunset, Operation Reclaim had a green light. The Army doesn't deploy to suburbs without a reason, but there are provisions, very old, very obscure ones in the federal code, that allow for joint training exercises on disputed or misappropriated federal exempt land, especially when there's evidence of criminal acquisition in violation of service member protections. Thanks to Dana and Luis, I had that evidence in spades. Within 72 hours, the 189th Urban Training Battalion approved a special exercise in Willow Glen. The land, including what had once been my home, would be designated a temporary training zone. The cover, Urban Reclamation Simulation. In reality, a full-scale, legally sanctioned occupation to seize and preserve the property until the legal dust settled. I wasn't coming to knock, I was coming to reclaim. Karen didn't see it coming. When the first Humvees rolled down Magnolia Drive, flanked by military police engineers and logistics trucks, she was still issuing HOA citations for lawn violations. I arrived 30 minutes later, dressed in civilian clothes but flanked by two uniformed liaisons. Karen burst through her front door in fury, silk robe flapping HOA clipboard, clutched like a shield. "You can't do this," she shrieked, pushing past a private first class who calmly held up a copy of the federal order. Her voice cracked when I handed her my own copy. "Operation Reclaim," I said. "You remember the property you called abandoned. It's officially under military protection pending investigation." She glanced down the street where soldiers were already erecting temporary fencing around the park, the clubhouse, and my original lot. "You're trespassing," she shouted. "No, Karen, you were." The next 24 hours were chaos for the HOA residents spilled into the streets. Some screamed, some recorded, some, to my quiet satisfaction, brought out lawn chairs and cheered. A few even offered coffee and snacks to the soldiers. Turns out not everyone in Willow Glen had been thrilled with Karen's reign of clipboard terror. The clubhouse was converted into a command post. My former foundation was marked with survey flags and digital scanners. Luis sent a drone to get a bird's eye view. The before and after footage was damning. My house erased a dog park in its place, and an illegal expansion of sidewalks and gardens that crossed into 5 separate private parcels, and then came the bombshell. One of the military's civil engineers discovered a fiber optic utility line buried illegally through what was once my crawl space tied to an unpermitted expansion project connecting 3 elite homes on the HOA board. Bingo. We now had federal infrastructure fraud on top of everything else. Karen panicked. She called a press conference in front of the community sign, ironically the same one that bore her name in gold leaf at the bottom. "This is an overreach," she said, voice trembling. "We are a peaceful community unfairly targeted by a disgruntled individual with connections." Jessica Harper, standing off to the side, raised her mic. "Do you deny authorizing the demolition of a home belonging to a deployed soldier?" Karen blinked. That lot was unoccupied. It was eyesore. It lacked conformity. The feed cut live to a shot of my service photo. Game over. The next morning, I filed a formal civil claim. Ramirez v. Willow Glen, HOA Karen McAllister, and related parties. Dana submitted everything: forged signatures, illegal filings, shell corporations, HOA board emails referring to my land as low-hanging fruit. Jessica published a follow-up story, Operation Reclaim, when a soldier fought back. Public support surged. Veterans across the country offered testimony. A retired judge even volunteered pro bono. Karen tried to rally the board. Only 2 members showed up. The rest resigned. But the best part, the federal audit. Once triggered, the Department of Housing and Urban Development began digging into all of Willow Glen's development filings. Within days, multiple homes, all built under Karen's oversight, were flagged for zoning violations, permit fraud, and improper fund allocation. HOA dues had been funneled into a community enhancement fund, which turned out to be Karen's personal landscaping bills. The walls were closing in, and this time she couldn't find her way out. That night, I walked the perimeter of my old foundation. The soldiers had set up lights. The outline of where the porch had once been glowed under soft LEDs. Someone handed me a hard hat and asked if I wanted to break ground when construction began. I nodded. "When we start, I'm doing it with the same hammer my mom used to hang the porch swing." Because this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about rebuilding not just my home, but the line in the sand. They thought no one would come back for this land. They were wrong. The first real crack in the wall wasn't the military boots on pristine sidewalks. It wasn't even the lawsuits piling up like autumn leaves. It was the silence, not the peaceful kind, the weaponized kind, the kind that spreads down cul-de-sacs like a virus. No more morning gossip over hedges, no more HOA newsletters slipped smugly into mailboxes, just wary eyes peeking through blinds. Neighbors unsure which side of history they were on. It was no longer Karen's Willow Glen. It was something else now, something raw, something real. And in the heart of it, the clubhouse stood surrounded by military fencing, like a failed kingdom's last fortress. Inside that fortress, the real war had begun. The Department of Housing's legal team arrived with clipboards and quiet scorn. They walked past Karen without a word, flashing federal credentials as they took over the second-floor meeting space. That same room where Karen once drafted bylaws about acceptable lawn sculpture sizes was now a temporary evidence locker. Boxes of paper records, hastily shredded but poorly hidden, were found in a back closet, emails printed and signed, dues reports that didn't match bank deposits, checkbooks with missing receipts, and in the middle of it all, a folder labeled Special Projects, confidential inside a map showing planned HOA expansion zones. One of them extended directly into city-owned land. Another crossed into a protected wetland buffer. There it was, agreed on paper, intent in black and white. Karen was summoned to testify before the Federal Land Review Board. She showed up in full pearls and denial. I was trying to preserve the neighborhood's integrity. She insisted. Dana, standing calmly at the other table, handed over the HOA email, where Karen wrote, "The military types don't understand order. They buy junk houses and hang flags on every porch. Not in my community." The boardroom went quiet. Karen's attorney asked for a recess. It was denied. Meanwhile, the soldiers continued their presence in Willow Glen. They weren't just holding the land, they were rebuilding it. On my former foundation, engineers dug test trenches, checked soil compaction, and marked zones for utilities. The Veterans Affairs Department, moved by public response, approved emergency funding for reconstruction. A nonprofit reached out. So did a national home builder with a Veterans Outreach Division. The pieces were coming together. But more importantly, so were the people. The residents who had once been too scared to speak started showing up. A man in his 70s, Harold Beckett, approached me on the lot, said he had helped lay the concrete for the original sidewalk 20 years ago. He never liked how Karen turned the place into a gulag with roses. He handed me an envelope. Original HOA founding documents. Inside was a line Karen never wanted anyone to read. HOA governance applies only to homes built post-Phase 2. My house had been Phase 1. Always exempt, she knew she'd known all along. The press circled back for interviews, local news national. Even a foreign outlet doing a special on American bureaucracy gone rogue. Jessica Harper returned this time with a full camera crew. When she asked Karen for comment outside the courthouse, Karen shoved the mic and yelled, "This is a military conspiracy." Jessica didn't flinch. Actually, she said, "This is accountability." That same day, I received a letter from the Department of Justice. An investigation into fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to defraud a federal service member had officially opened. Karen's cousin, the fake contractor, had turned state's evidence. He named her the treasurer and 2 board members as orchestrators. He even admitted to bulldozing my home at 3 a.m. under Karen's direct orders, knowing full well I was deployed. That night I didn't sleep, not from stress, from relief. By the end of the week, the Willow Glen HOA had been suspended by court order. All dues frozen, all fines nullified. Karen's personal assets, her house included, were placed under review for restitution. Neighbors gathered outside her home with folding chairs and coffee mugs, not in protest, but in curiosity. They watched as she packed boxes into a dusty SUV, face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses. She didn't speak to anyone. Someone had taped a sign to her mailbox. Accountability now in session. And then, just as fast as it all unraveled, it stopped. The soldiers left. The news trucks moved on, and Willow Glen stood quiet. Real quiet this time. I visited the rebuilt foundation one last time that month. A new porch beam waited for its first nail. Dana handed me the hammer. "This is yours now," she said, legally, morally, permanently. I drove in the first nail where my mom's porch swing would hang again. And for the first time since I returned, I smiled like a man who had truly come home. They say rebuilding is the hard part. I disagree. Rebuilding is the sweet part, because every nail, every board, every porch slat is a win you can touch. By the time the HOA was officially dissolved, Karen was long gone, slipped out in the early hours with her pearls, 3 suitcases, and what dignity she could scrape off the sidewalk. The Willow Glen sign was taken down 2 days later. In its place, we put up a new one. It read simply, "Welcome to Willow Rise." No HOA, just neighbors. And for the first time since I deployed, I woke up to birds instead of bureaucracy. The rebuild took 5 weeks. The original footprint was restored exactly as it had been, down to the swing bolts my mom had drilled into the porch beam. The builder even found reclaimed cedar that matched the original trim and offered it at cost after hearing the story on the radio. Volunteers showed up every weekend. People I didn't know brought food. Veterans dropped off tools. One guy left an American flag and a note that said, "Welcome home, Sergeant. You fought for us. We stand for you." I didn't cry reading it, but I did have a sudden allergy attack involving sawdust. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Meanwhile, Karen's saga wasn't over. Turns out her cousin flipped hard, named every fake vote, every shady land deal, and every dollar skimmed from HOA fees. In court, he claimed Karen referred to the HOA board as my civilian army. The judge wasn't impressed. She was fined $85,000 in restitution and sentenced to 6 months of house arrest. Unfortunately for her, the house was no longer hers. So she served her sentence in a 1-bedroom rental behind a gas station with a lawn smaller than my old welcome mat. Poetic justice? No. That was still to come. Because a few weeks later, the neighborhood held a reclamation BBQ. Not a fundraiser, not a political stunt, just burgers, lemonade, and a community finally breathing free. Someone made cupcakes shaped like little eviction notices. Another guy brought a karaoke machine and sang, "We're not gonna hate you," to the tune of Twisted Sister. It was glorious. But the highlight, right there in the garden where my mom used to plant sunflowers, stood a brand new wooden sign handmade. Carved with care, this land was stolen, now it's sacred. The story didn't end there. Jessica Harper's expose won a regional journalism award. The military training program that reclaimed Willow Glen was expanded nationally. They named the legal protocol used in my case the Ramirez Clause, a new safeguard for deployed service members, and the house. It stood again, porch swing and all. Every nail in that home was a reminder. I came back, I stood my ground, and I won. Not through rage, not through revenge, but through truth, patience, community. And a perfectly timed military training exercise that just happened to include a helicopter hovering over Karen's former garden gnome collection. So now when people drive through Willow Rise, there's no HOA, there's no Karen, there's just the swing creaking on my porch. And sometimes if the light hits just right, you can still see the outline of where the old mailbox stood. It's empty now, and that's exactly how I like it. They thought they could erase a soldier's home with paperwork and playgrounds. Instead, they got a federal takedown live on their front lawn. The HOA is gone. Karen vanished with her wine fridge and fake titles, and my house. It's standing tall again, porch, swing flag and all, because some wars aren't fought overseas. They're fought in your own backyard. This was HOA Karen Files, if you love justice, revenge, and watching Karens crash harder than HOA budgets. Like, comment, subscribe. And don't forget to tell us, what would you have done if they sold your land while you were deployed? See you next time, and remember, sometimes karma wears combat boots.